Hello, it's Kevin Annett. It's November 8th, 2015. Today I'd like to read to you some excerpts from my upcoming book entitled Unrelenting. I want to start with a little bit of the history, the things that led me to my present situation. Going back to the year I was ordained. The year is 1990 and the location is southwest Manitoba, where I have my first charge as a United Church minister. Down the road from my home pastoral charge were my two smaller parishes of a few dozen people, remnants of once thriving communities when that leg of the railway was still operating. Lyleton still bore the resemblance of a town, although the post office had closed the year before I arrived. Its United Church was the only public building left in town, where on busy Sundays 10 or 15 congregants could be found singing the old hymns a cappella, since they had no organist, or more likely they were all staunch Presbyterians. The other parish, Coultervale, had evaporated long before, and its citizens were scattered in lone farmhouses like lonely sentinels in an unending night. My parishioners there used the abandoned community center for their worship services, but they could boast an organist at least, a cheery young fellow named Greg Fletcher, who pounded away on an old piano during the services and sang along with everyone to help out all the aged and stumbling voices. The following year, Greg Fletcher would choke to death at the dinner table in front of his new wife, Betty, but I was gone by then. The Downey family held sway in both towns. Leighton Downey was a kindly old man who was the chairman of the Coultervale Church, but he called the shots in Lyleton too, since long ago his grandfather had donated the land to the Presbyterians to build a church there. Leighton also helped me gain 10 pounds that year that I was there by his irresistible homemade baking, samples of which I always found faithfully placed on the seat of my Jeep after every Sunday service. 50 years before that, during World War II, Leighton and his brother Frank had married two sisters from nearby Brandon and brought them to their homestead farms west of the town. A year later, the sisters had lost their baby brother at the shooting gallery called the Battle of Dieppe, and then a month later their oldest brother's Lancaster bomber was shot down over Germany. Commemorating the death of the two Downey brothers became the focal point of the religious life of both communities over the years, as if the determination never to forget them would somehow also preserve the spirit of those people that was dissipating like the good soil blown into four directions. I caught on to that central story in their lives early on, and it helped me to speak to them from the pulpit in something more than abstractions and metaphors. What was difficult and practically impossible was to get any of them to budge from their age-old pew positions in order to move closer to me during the Sunday service. It made sense, I suppose, in the still-standing church in Lyleton, where a tottering old woman of 90 once nostalgically pointed to her 8-year-old initial she had carved on the wooden pew an entire lifetime before. And she said to me, "My family and I have always sat there, Reverend, and I'll be here even after I'm gone to meet my Maker." Fair enough. Although I had to pretty much bellow to be heard to the bare dozen of the Lyleton congregation dispersed throughout the 200-person capacity church. But this stubborn stick-to-your-own-spot attitude seemed slightly ridiculous in the Coultervale congregation, where folding chairs constituted the pews and were rearranged every week. Regardless of that, everyone could always be found in exactly the same place every Sunday. And the one time I really caught shit with the Coultervale congregation was when I arrived early one week and decided to set up the chairs in a circle, with me officiating in the center. "And what the hell is all this?" demanded one of the normally quiet old ladies as she stood in the doorway. And that was that. It was more than a challenge to do all 3 of the Sunday services in the time allotted to me, and required a lot of fast driving down gravel roads to cover the 40-mile diameter of my charge. The Pearson church service was first at 9:30 a.m., then Lyleton at 11, and Coultervale at 12:30. They rotated every year, but the breakneck routine was sometimes hazardous. I once sped off into a ditch on my way to Lyleton, thankfully not during the winter, and a local farmer pulled me out with his tractor in time to make at least part of the service, bruised but intact. The local RCMP detachment came to know me quite well on the back roads, and parked cops would usually just wave at me as I sped by well over the speed limit, since they all knew where I was bound and why. After my first few weeks of the Sunday mania, Leighton Downey used to stand in the doorway of the community hall, pretending to look vexed when I ran up clutching my Bible and robe, tapping his watch with a fake scowl, and sometimes handing me a towel to dab the imagined sweat off my brow. It must have been a source of amusement to the different congregations, since none of the previous ministers had kept to the church schedule with that kind of precision. And sometimes I heard me referred to as the, quote, Indy 500 pastor in the co-op coffee shop in Pearson, to various choruses of laughter from the farmers gathered there, who obviously knew a Mountie or two. Those were really golden days for me, and not only from the natural joy of being a new father and minister, and a man very much in love with his wife, I was regularly surprised by heaven. One Saturday I was called out to do a funeral far out in the prairies south of Lyleton, practically on the North Dakota border. A small crowd awaited me at the cemetery atop a little forested hill. I'd have met normally with the family beforehand to get to know everyone before the service, but the deceased was a woman from outside the district with no relations who were still alive, and the undertaker in Melita knew that I'd do the service, and so he asked me. They were all strange and aged faces that welcomed me as I swung open the metal gate and stood over the casket in the open ground. It was a cold and blustery day. The mourners were all fellow residents of the care home where she had died, and apparently her death was not unexpected. So I said some prayers and words, and then asked if anyone had something to say about Eunice, the one who had left us. The wind was the only response, and for a while we all just stood there in our own thoughts, until finally a very old woman stepped forward and she spoke very softly, and she said these words, Eunice here was my dearest and oldest friend ever since we were 4 years old. I knew her through bad times and good ones. She lived here right through the droughts and all the depression, and she had 3 children and she lost 2 of them. But the worse things got, the better she got. And that was all that needed to be said. Some 3 years later, I ended up in Port Alberni on Canada's west coast, where a lot of this revelation of the residential school genocide was uncovered because of what I began to experience in that town and other things. But the word genocide is an abstraction to all of us. But before that word genocide came its reality. Before I spoke about the crime, I bore it in my own grasp the night that a little Indian boy called Arthur Gomez died. This was in October 1993. Now, Arthur Gomez was an odd name for an Indian, especially West Coast natives, but I never asked about it after getting the call to hurry to West Coast General Hospital. It was past midnight, and my own family was fast asleep. He's dead, Reverend. Our little boy, he's dead. His father met me on the ward, crushed, beyond help. The mother was passed out, drugged to dull her hysteria, and Arthur's tiny corpse lay beside her on the bed. I don't remember our words, for they meant nothing next to the little life that could never be lived. I do recall lifting that impossibly light body in my arms and carrying it to the bathroom sink, where, true to the Father's wishes, I baptized Arthur Gomez in the name of a reclusive God. The baby's hair was jet black and damp and still warm. I remember kissing that hair and handing the father his son. I never saw them again. Arthur was given a traditional New Chelmsford native burial, the kind denied so many other dead brown babies buried in secret just a mile from where Arthur had died. His mother had survived the Alberni Christian death camp called a residential school, although not really. But her subsequent drinking and drug-taking had claimed her son in as sacred a place as her own womb. I spoke about Arthur Gomez the next Sunday in church. I was told it was inappropriate to do so. And finally, many years later in Vancouver, in the streets of Vancouver in 2012, my friend Harry Wilson died, another dead Native man. Harry Wilson died the way he had lived, unnoticed and battered. He had been one of the very first Port Alberni residential school survivors who had spoken out, and he usually showed up at all our demonstrations and radio programs. Afterwards, Harry and I always parted with something incomplete between us, as if we were preparing to never see each other again. That went on for years, because unlike most of the other residential school survivors, Harry beat the odds for a long time. Living on and off the street like most of our group did, Harry endured as if by a miracle. He regularly slipped his way into hospital bathrooms and drank off all the alcoholic hand wash from the dispensers. He bartered away his clothes for a Mickey of rye. Most of the time he couldn't string 5 words together without gagging or crying. But the years slipped by and Harry Wilson was still there. A special kind of fiber allows a boy to undergo anal rape and electric shocks to his penis and then speak about it 30 years later to strangers. Time and his enemies wore at this hard substance in Harry, but it did so only slowly, allowing the crime and his character to be known. But eventually it all caught up to him. I was out of town when he died. The city coroner was especially tight-lipped about how Harry had died. None of the usual excuses to cover the killing of an Indian were offered. Neither suicide, nor alcoholic poisoning, nor tuberculosis was given as Harry's cause of death. Nothing had caused it, apparently. He just died. I retain a picture of he and I in better times, on the eve of our first tribunal in the summer of 1998, when we thought that telling the truth would make a difference. Here is smiling as best as he could in the photo, his arm self-consciously hooked around my shoulder. Harry could never be touched by anyone, but that day we were arm in arm. He always cried the hardest when he recalled finding the body of a young girl on the grounds of the Alberni Residential School when he was only 12 years old. She was small, covered in blood, and stone cold. She had died the way Harry would one day, which is perhaps why he never stopped talking about her, and why he never let go of her. More to come.